So good morning, Dr. Kaplan. Thanks for being on the show.
Oh, thank you very much, and good evening to you.
Yeah, we're
Hello.
we're in three different time zones. You being in Australia, and Kate in the north of England, and me in Los Angeles. So you were a contributor to the recent miniseries that came out, Hitler's Secret Sex Life. And I got to say, I binged the entire series this past week. Only four
Mm.
episodes, so not too much, but I found it enthralling, salacious at times, and very informative. I mean, that's. I was telling Kate about this. I was like, I learned. I mean, I knew a lot of things about Hitler and his sexuality and his drug use, but there are quite a few things I didn't know beforehand. So my first question is, how did you get involved with the miniseries?
They contacted me to do the series, and I was under a slight misapprehension. I thought they were going to do Hitler the whole life, and they
Oh,
interviewed me for 2.5 hours at least. They were in Australia, so they did it in my rooms. And I remember because it was the week before COVID lockdown and everything
Right.
disappeared. And the next thing I was getting calls from people in America, England, South Africa. I saw you on a show about Hitler's sex life. And they just released it somewhere in the middle of the COVID epidemic.
well, so you're a forensic psychiatrist. Like, had you studied Hitler's sex life prior to this documentary or written books about it?
I had studied Hitler as, you might say, a medical historian. And of course, when you do something like that, your forensic background always plays a part. So I had my chapter on Hitler in my second book called The Exceptional Brain. And I sort of kicked it off from there.
Yeah, I wonder if they were familiar with the book and they're like, hey, this guy is very knowledgeable. He'd be a good contributor to the show. The other thing I noticed is Norman Ohler, who's the author of Blitzed, which is the book that came out a few years ago about Hitler's or drug use in the Third Reich. He was also a contributor, and he was a guest on our podcast a few years back. So it was kind of cool seeing him in there as well.
Yeah, he wrote a very interesting book, but I think in retrospect, people got a bit confused if he should have done two books, one about drug use in the whole Third Reich with the soldiers and politicians,
Yeah.
and then a separate one about Hitler. But that's just a small point.
Yeah, I actually, after reading Blitzed, I thought it should have been two separate books
Yeah.
because they're both two huge subjects that are kind
Yeah.
of very different too.
And he kind of condensed it. That's what was interesting about this miniseries, is because they spent a good portion of it going into Dr. Morell and Hitler's relationship with Dr. Morell and his drug use, as well as like his Hitler's psychosexuality and things like that. So I thought they did it really well the way they fit it in.
That's how I got onto writing about Hitler. I first wrote about Dr. Morell because I'm always interested in strange and dysfunctional doctors. So once I wrote about Morell, it was easy to expand into the whole Hitler universe.
A fascinating character, that could be a
Yeah.
subject of a future show, Kate, is Hitler's relationship
Oh,
with his
Dr.
drug
Morell.
dealer.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know a good portion of Blitzed is devoted to that. So anyway, back to the series. So, in your opinion, why is there such a morbid fascination with Hitler's sex life? I mean, after all these years, we still want to label him as a deviant. Why is that?
I think you've got to compare Hitler with the other two mass murderers of the 20th century, namely Stalin and Mao Zedong. Both of them are terrible people who, in fact, killed between them more people than Hitler did. But it's Hitler's personality and his character, his sheer strangeness that interests people and pulls them in. The last time I was looking at the statistics, they say there are now more books on Hitler than anybody else except Jesus Christ. And they just keep pouring out.
Yeah, I
Yes.
would definitely believe that. But I mean, people like are striving to label him as a deviant. Is it because they're trying to just not justify but rationalize what it is that he did and that a normal human wouldn't be capable of that, but a freak of nature could?
There's three answers to that. The first one is, of course, there were a lot of people looking for any excuse. to understand Hitler's behavior. Secondly, he was at a time when leaders and politicians were all married with children, or if they weren't married because of being widowed, they at least followed obvious relationship. Hitler, by contrast, gave this thing, he is married to the German people. And he went to great lengths that this image was never disturbed. That's why he kept Eva Braun out of the picture. The other thing is that people around him, like those around his niece, Kelly Raubal, who really were very angry when she committed suicide and were starting to put out very salacious rumors about his sexuality, but we have no way of proving them.
Yeah.
That is one thing about this documentary is like, how do you prove, these allegations and these rumors? And many of the witnesses and the sources, are kind of questionable in their credibility. Like Otto Strasser. I mean, he was a Nazi turned informant, hated Hitler. So how can we believe what's coming out of his mouth?
That's the problem between, let's put it this way, the public discourse and real history. So historians will say that is just not relevant evidence. It's not strong enough.
Yeah, it's true. So I found it really interesting that you draw a parallel between the childhood of many serial killers and Hitler. And by that, I mean, he grew up in a household with an overbearing mother and a physically abusive father. Can you blame his actions as an adult on the abuse he suffered as a child?
To some extent, but you've got to put it into perspective. The question is, was his father as abusive as people think, or was he just a typical semi-peasant Austrian father at the end of the 19th century? In other words, they were all like that. And of course, a bit of booze in the background didn't make it any better. And for what all his father did, his mother totally coddled him. But your earlier point is quite correct. I'm busy working on Timothy McVeigh, and I've drawn up a comparison between McVeigh's background and personality and Hitler's. Now, I'm not trying to say that what McVeigh did was up to Hitler's standard, but it's very interesting that he had a completely reverse situation to Hitler. He hated his mother because she left the home and he thought she was a slut, but he adored his father and grandfather. And both, if you look the next step, both of them were indifferent students, although they were highly intelligent. And then in later life, McVeigh never had a lasting relationship. In fact, he went to some extent to avoid it. And oddly enough, if he had affairs, they were mostly with other men's wives. Hitler, of course, you know what his relationships with women were like. So there's quite a long list there. And if you look at the criteria for serial killers, what they use in profiles, you will definitely find an overlap with what Hitler was like and what he did.
Well, another connection to a lot of serial killers is their relationship with their mother. So do you think Hitler had an aberrant relationship with his mother, Clara?
The question about aberrant is difficult to define. It was what we call overbonded. He was extremely close to her, and she responded in kind. Now, their Jewish GP in the town he was living in treated her when she died of breast cancer. And he later said in all his years as a doctor, he had never seen someone as distraught as Hitler was at his mother's funeral. Although I later added in a comment in another discussion I had, well, you didn't see Elvis Presley at his mother's funeral.
Oh,
Yeah, exactly. But
poor Gladys.
so do you think, though, of his relationship with his mother, whether it being like she was doting or overbearing, did that warp his view on intimacy with women in general?
Yes, I think so, because no woman could match up to this standard of idealization that he had of his mother. And that's why you can see that he really went for young women, let's call them, because they were no threat as a real person. He could manipulate them, he could mold them. In fact, this is what he said: I want young women that I can shape the way I like.
It reminds me of Ed Gein. Like, there's a lot of Ed Gein. Like, Hitler could have been digging up graveyards to like mold his women too.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's a standard feature
Yeah.
with serial killers. Can I quote another one for you? Dr. Harold Shipman, the
Yeah, of course.
GP in England, who's the greatest, most prolific serial killer in British history. Now, he came from a working class background. His father was a council truck driver, and he really wasn't much on the scene. But Shipman's relationship with his mother was very intense. And when he was 13 or 14, when his father was on night duty, he would sleep in the bed with his mother. And of course, he was already a teenager. Now, no one can say it became incestuous, but it certainly was very intense. And when she dies of cancer when he's 17, he spends the night running through the rain. He just can't deal with it.
Well, I mean, Hitler was shattered after his mother died, and I think he was distraught from, which I
Yes.
think led him to, because he was lost to sign up for the war. It was the First World War, and yet I think he was. You said he was rejected by the Austrian army, but accepted by the German army.
Well, it's a very interesting point, isn't it? That today, post Vietnam, we would call Hitler a draft dodger because he refused to serve in the Austro-Hungarian army because he said it's full of other races, it's full of Jews. So that's why he scarpered to Munich. But the interesting thing is, as you can imagine, medical tribunals, they are not easy to get through. They don't want to give people an easy ticket, yet they rejected him when he was ostensibly perfectly healthy. I mean, he was leading a normal life. And my speculation, because he, of course, had the documents destroyed, is that they found his congenital deformities.
Okay.
Well, that was the thing, and part of that could be related to the inbreeding of his family, and so the
Yeah.
miniseries goes into that
Mhm.
his parents were related, like they were first cousins. So how common was inbreeding in Austria at that time?
Well, not in the whole of Austria, but in that area that he lived, it was extremely common because it was a very low down on the class structure. They were all rural and it was very sort of closed in. So that was very common. You know, he had to get permission, his father had to get permission from the Pope before a priest would marry the third wife, Hitler's mother, because they were so closely related.
Well, did you mention in the series, and I had never known this, that his surname originally was Schickel Gruber, and they changed that
Mm-hmm.
to Hitler, which, yeah, I think you made the quip that, could you imagine saying Heil Schickel Gruber? Just doesn't have the same ring to it.
Correct. And his father was the one who changed it.
And why was that?
Yeah, why did they
Sorry?
pick Hitler?
Because there was this other line in the family, Hitler, Heidler, Heutler, and he wanted to get access to an inheritance. So that was the reason for changing it. So these people were very, can you call it, rootless in terms of the normal boundaries of family limits.
That wasn't. That is interesting. And people don't know exactly who Alois or his father's father was, right? Isn't that the question that people have, that he could be an Ashkenazi Jew or his, Hitler's grandfather?
I think the literature, or rather the research into that, has more or less settled on the fact that it wasn't a Jewish servant of a rich guy living in the area. So they pretty much excluded that. Now, the series you are talking about, they claimed they had some of Hitler's DNA, and they couldn't prove anything about Jewish ancestry. Although, DNA testing is on such a broad scale, I don't know if that gets you anywhere.
Yeah. So let's talk about another rumor here. And Kate and I were arguing about this. Did Hitler have only one testicle? And has that been proven?
Yes.
See, Kate doesn't
Ah,
believe it.
no question about that. In 1924, what was called the Beer Hall Putsch,
Yes.
forgive my German. So he was arrested and taken to this prison. And they found about 8 years ago, they found his medical examination when he was admitted. Somehow, when he got into power, he forgot to send his people there to destroy the records. And it clearly says he is missing a testicle. And that fits in with the idea of other congenital deformities.
At the time. And I think you also mentioned that he had, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, but hypospadia, which caused him
Correct.
yeah, he couldn't urinate properly.
Yes, hypospadias is a hole in the urethra at the tip of your penis, so you always leak. And this was well described by his friends. Of course, he just could have been sloppy. But Fritz Redlich, who's really, to my mind, written the best book on Hitler's health, pointed out that those two things, hypoorchidism and hypospadias, usually go with something called occult spina bifida, which means the bottom end of your spine. There's usually a hole or two, and it's not complete.
And do you think this is a product of inbreeding?
Very difficult to say. I'm not a specialist in what can you say, how these deformities come about. It could just be bad luck. Sometimes some of these deformities occur because the mother doesn't have the right nutrition in pregnancy. So it's highly speculative.
Well, what's interesting about it is that Hitler was a victim of sexual bullying, and in World War One. Maybe they knew his genitalia was malformed, but another connection between serial killers with deformed genitals can also lead to, hatred towards women and
Yeah.
insecurity based on that.
That's true. I'm not sure how much sexual bullying he had in World War One. The guys in his, what do you call it, platoon used to mock him because they all wanted to chase girls and go off to brothels, and he would say, stay home, and paid no interest in that. That's pretty well documented.
Well, was he a virgin in when he was in the army?
Well, it depends. It seems highly likely because there was a guy called August Kubitschek, and Kubitschek was a friend of his who lived with him in the early Vienna days. And Kubitschek said he never went near women. They once went to look at a new boarding house, and the woman who ran it came to the door, and she was somewhat loose and dressed in a plunging outfit. And Hitler just sort of shuddered and pulled back and said, "This woman is what was the biblical term? A Jezebel or a Potiphar. We can't with her." And he also described Hitler falling in love with a woman called Stephanie in his hometown. He
Stephanie
never spoke
Isaac.
to Stephanie.
This is
And
the
he
woman
had
he
this
stalked.
fantasy relationship
Yes.
that they were going to marry. And then he eventually realized she didn't even know him and wasn't going to have anything to do with him. And this is very interesting. His comment is, well, to August was, "All right, well, I'm going to grab her and we'll both jump off a bridge." That was his way of dealing with a failed relationship.
Wasn't Stephanie Isaac Jewish?
Um, I'm not sure. I think she had a Jewish relative, but I'm not sure if she was actually Jewish. I'll leave that open.
He has a very scorched earth policy even back then, doesn't he? It's like this woman who doesn't even know we're dating will just kill each other.
Yeah.
when she
To
finds
make a
out.
comparison to modern terms, are you familiar with the term incel, involuntary celibate?
Are these guys who hate feminists and want to stay virgins or complain about being virgins?
Yeah, the complaint. I get more of an asexuality thing from Hitler
Okay.
myself, rather than being an incel.
Incels are people who hate women, and because
Mhm.
they aren't able to engage in intercourse with women, whether because they're terrified of women or they're too scared to approach them. But Hitler stalked Stephanie Isaac for 4 years, never spoke to
Yes.
her, not even
Yeah.
once. And he was enraged by male attention that she received from others. So this is all very indicative of the behaviors of incels. So I'm wondering if that's kind of what Hitler, was at that time. He obviously was sexually
I think you
immature.
could call him a proto incel. But I must tell you that Timothy McVeigh had one great love in his life, a woman called Augustine. And Augustine liked McVeigh, but she said, I'm not having an affair or a relationship with you, but we can be friendly. And she went on to get married. And he virtually stalked her because he went to enormous effort to find out where she'd moved and tracked her down there. So similar kind of thing.
Yeah, similar mentality. So I want to
Yeah.
chat about, you mentioned her earlier, but Hitler's younger niece, Jelly Rabal. How would you characterize her
Mm-hmm.
relationship? Was it sexual?
By all accounts, how can I put it? If you were in a court, you would say on the balance of probabilities, it was sexual. And this is for several reasons. Firstly, Jelly was no angel. In
Yeah.
fact, she was pretty close to promiscuous. So it would seem surprising that they didn't do it. Secondly, the way the two of them were doing things, going into rooms and moving around, people around them assumed that it was sexual. So I would say on balance, it was likely that they did.
Well, one of the more salacious allegations in the series is that Hitler wasn't interested in conventional sex. And I think it was Otto
Mm.
Strasser who claimed that Jelly told him that Hitler would have her squat over his face and urinate on him. So is there any truth to that rumor?
It's really, you've got to decide how much credibility you give the person who's issuing that rumor. I think he also said Hitler was into coprophilia, which is even worse than urolagnia, which, by the way, is the technical term for what you're describing for
Oh,
listeners who want to practice it. Um,
sure.
but can you believe it when it's just a single comment from a biased observer? It really fits in with what they wanted Hitler to be.
A
Exactly. And I
deviant,
think you
a
could
sexual
almost,
deviant.
well, I think it also fed into the propaganda that was being disseminated from, the US and England at the time, about Hitler. So you have to question the credibility of someone like Otto Strasser, though I'd like to believe it. So the one thing I find kind of interesting too about his relationship with Jelly compared to Ava Braun. So Ava Braun, like he kept that under wraps. Like he kept that relationship very secret, but yet he appeared in public with Jelly, his niece, who was significantly younger than him. What did the other Nazi leaders think about that?
Well, remember that relationship with Jelly was around 1929. And at that stage, the Nazi Party was by no means a certainty. They were strongly competing with the Communist Party. The Depression hadn't really hit yet, and that was what kicked them in. So he was just an up and coming party leader who was based in Munich and not such a big deal. But the minute he got into power, that was a different issue. Then he was a national figure, and that's why he kept Eva Braun hidden.
The thing I find most interesting about Jelly is she has a pattern with a lot of Hitler's girlfriends or women associated with him in that she kills herself. And he has a lot of women associated with him who end up killing themselves.
3 out of 5.
Three out of
Yes,
five. That's
which
a
is
lot.
like, let's put it like that. I have more than five
Oh,
ex-boyfriends and they're all still alive. So
mhm.
Hitler had some power to do that. Although I do think Jelly did definitely suffer with mental problems.
No. I mean, she might have been on the edge of what you call a bit of a flamboyant personality. She really wasn't very bright. She was just a party girl.
Yes, like
Um,
Ava.
but I don't think she was in any sense crazy.
Well, in the series, they try to characterize Hitler as a controlling sexual psychopath. Did he control Jelly to the point where she committed suicide?
I think
Because
that was a significant factor. Leave out the sexual psychopath part, but controlling. played a huge part in her disaffection with the relationship. And she complained bitterly that he would insist how she dressed, where she went, and how she behaved. And the final straw was when she defied him and went to Vienna for opera lessons. And I think the opera teacher was Jewish, which didn't help
Oh.
the situation. And it was after that he threw a tantrum and she killed herself.
Well, people say that you could question whether or not she actually committed suicide and she might have possibly been
Yeah.
murdered.
Yeah, I know there's the author who wrote the book that suggested that or put up a case for it, but I really think the evidence is pretty weak, and that's speaking from a forensic point of view.
Hmm. Well, so, Hitler's been accused of having this Lolita syndrome, but wasn't he also involved with another woman, Mimi Ryder, who was 16 when he was 37?
I know he was involved with her. I just haven't got the dates to hand, but it sounds right. Yeah, it's interesting the comparison. All these high flying women, like Hannah Wright, the amazing pilot, and Leni Riefenstahl. Now, these were stunning women, highly accomplished and very creative and very good looking. And they clicked onto Hitler, but he didn't want to know about them.
I feel the same about Unity Mitford because he could have had that would have been like a political power movement if they'd have gotten together. But she was super into him and he enjoyed her, but never went any further. He, in fact, slept with one of her friends, didn't he? Irma?
I'm not sure about that, but I'm always, when you talk about sex with Unity, according to the book, I mean, she would have gangbangs
Oh, yeah.
with the SS. So you might say Unity had enough on her little plate
She was a busy
to not
gal.
need Hitler to satisfy that, if you know what I mean.
I do.
But were those women closer to Hitler's own age? Because it sounds like he was definitely attracted to women that were much younger.
Definitely. There's no question about that.
So, what about his relationship with German actress Renate Muller?
I'm really not too well informed on that. I think it was a sort of, did he take her for a few dates and show her, I don't know, what his flat or something, but I just don't know whether. Am I correct? She did say they'd had sex once or twice.
But she also said that he was really into like extreme S&M. Like he wanted her to kick him and beat him and and be her slave while he masturbated. And that's also coming from Otto Strasser.
Yeah, yeah. And remember, you can look at another example is August Kubitschek. Now, Kubitschek was a complete non-entity, but suddenly his old pal Hitler's the most powerful man in Europe. So people descend on him. He gives them a highly favorable account of Hitler. Then the war comes and they interview him again, and he's swapped around, much more negative and probably more accurate picture. So you've got to also ask at what time in Hitler's progression they were interviewed.
That's
Yes.
true. Well, the other thing too with the outcome for Renate, she was committed to a sanitarium, and then she accidentally fell out of a window. So they say after the
Yeah,
Gestapo visited her. So
yes. So another one of his had an untimely end. Had I can't remember from the series. Did the issue of Hitler having syphilis come up?
they
I was going
mentioned
to ask about
they
that.
mentioned his, I guess, aversion towards prostitutes. And at one point, August Kubitschek and Hitler, I think they were in Germany, and they walked by like the red light district, or they walked through the red light district. And Hitler wanted to go through twice so he could look at them. But it was more like voyeuristic rather than engaging.
Yeah, he's sort of Salvador Dali, keep everything at a distance and pervert it. But Hitler was obsessed with syphilis. There's 13 pages in Mein Kampf where he rants and raves about syphilis destroying the race and how it is Jews that are carrying it around. So obviously that would fit into the issue about prostitutes.
But there's kind of evidence that maybe Hitler had syphilis.
Ah,
Oh.
unfortunately not. Um, I wrote a paper on that. I don't know if I sent that to you, but it's been examined quite carefully, and particularly the eye specialist who treated him towards the end of his life was quite emphatic that there's nothing there to indicate it.
So that's just a rumor, basically.
Interestingly, a comparison, every great leader, a tyrant, they want to say has got syphilis. Now, we know Mao Zedong had gonorrhea plus, plus,
Yeah.
plus. They tried to put it on Stalin, but it didn't work. But interestingly, some Israelis went to the Russian archives in 1992 and showed that Lenin had died from syphilis, which the Russians had covered up for many years.
I mean, syphilis was definitely rife during that period. And maybe that's one of the reasons why, with his platoon, he avoided going out with them. And I'm sure they were, cavorting with prostitutes. And maybe it seemed like Hitler was kind of, it was pathologically terrified of getting syphilis. And maybe that's why he avoided any kind of sexual encounters.
I
Okay.
agree with you with the first part. He was pathologically obsessed with syphilis, not only for him, but as a sort of a national pollution. I just think it's one of the factors in his general avoidance of casual relationships. And again, choosing women that he knew absolutely about their backgrounds and that there was no chance they could have been highly promiscuous. How that applies to Kelly, I must admit, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder. So did he outlawed prostitution though? But it was, I don't know if it was legal or if it was accepted prior to what, 1930.
Brothels were um, outlawed, but then several of them were set up with people like Goering and Himmler as places where they could get information. In other words, to be informers. And then, of course, in the German army, the soldiers had what they called field brothels, usually
Yeah.
Jewish women taken from the camps.
The Spandau Ballets.
And being forced into
Yeah,
prostitution. Yeah.
yeah.
So speaking of things that I guess Himmler outlawed, homosexuality, that was something that was also commonplace in the early days of the Third Reich. But then Hitler kind of did a full about face on that. Do you think there's any credence to the theory that Hitler was a homosexual?
No, I also read the book. I just don't see anything in that.
Yeah.
The issue of the Third Reich's attitude to homosexuality, yes. The paradox was they were putting homosexuals with the pink star in the camps.
Yeah.
And yet a number of the leading members of the Nazi party were clearly homosexual and would
Yeah.
go off and have these parties. What about the guy who was the head of the SA?
Yeah, Ernst Röhm.
It's from.
Yeah, they found him in bed with a young man, and then shot him, of course.
But he was an overt homosexual, and it said in the series
Yeah.
that he was so close to Hitler that he called him Addy.
You see, you've got to remember in the early days, this is a party building up. They're completely obscure. They need anyone they can get hold of who will back them up. So, in that sense, Hitler was prepared to overlook it. But as he moved up, as he got into power, it was more the image he wanted to project, and therefore that was outlawed.
Well, in the series, they postulate that he killed Rome to hide evidence of his own homosexuality, but that's
Nice
spurious.
idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that was the other thing too, that Rudolf Hess, who people also say was a closeted homosexual, but and in the movie they postulate that Hitler was intimate with Hess when they were in prison together.
Oh no.
Once again, I
Yeah,
don't know. You can't really prove these allegations. There's no real evidence. It's all
no,
hearsay.
no. It's all the same thing. You've got to look at who gives the rumor, when they give it, and their credibility. And simply the fact that the two of them were in jail and Hess was his amanuensis and writing down his dictation for Mein Kampf hardly makes him into homosexual. Hitler had his own almost palatial kind of room in the prison where he had all sorts of facilities and privileges. And Hess certainly wasn't stuck in a cell with him.
So let's chat about Eva Braun. So we did mention that that he was, secretive with his relationship with her. Do you think she was miserable? Like, do you think she resented the relationship?
You mean resented the control or being in a relationship with him?
Well, they were together 13 years, never married, never had children. It, it's kind of common knowledge that she was sexually dissatisfied because didn't she reach out to Dr. Morell about like a I don't know Nazi Viagra that had like bull semen in it or something?
She did. Look, remember, she'd made 2 attempts at suicide,
Yeah.
what we'd call parasuicide, because he spent so little time with her and she was just tucked away and sent money and told to behave herself. So she was enormously frustrated. And whenever he would bring her to the Bavarian palace that he had there, she was delighted to mix with the top Nazis. And of course, you could also ask, well, why did she join him at the end to kill herself with him and get married when she could have stayed where she was at home and survived?
That was one of my questions. I was wondering why would she join him in the bunker and get married after all this time? I mean, was she in love with him?
How do you define love? I think she had invested so much of herself into the relationship that she's sitting there. The war is lost. The Russians are just about on their doorstep. And I think she saw it as a kind of, well, it's all been a waste of time, but at least I'll go down in history as his wife.
Yeah, do you think that was his final act of control over her? After 13 years of stringing her along, he can finally, like, take her to the grave with him. Like,
Well, it
I'll
was
marry
finally his
you.
final concession. Remember, he said to her, don't come and join me in the bunker, but she turned up anyway, and then he was very grateful. It was the only time he was ever seen in public kissing her.
Do you think they ever had sexual intercourse? I mean, they interviewed her hairdresser who said under oath that she told him that they had never had sex.
Well, then they interviewed the people at Berchtesgaden, forgive my pronunciation, the maids, and she said that you could tell from the bed that things had been happening. So there you go. I think the current opinion among, Ian Kershaw, who's really regarded as the definitive biography, said, taking all this evidence into account, it is likely that Hitler and Eva Braun had normal sex intermittently. In other words, they weren't at it. It wasn't regular, but it happened. And I think that's probably going to be the last word on it.
Well, the other thing too is towards the end of his life. I mean, how many drugs was he on? I wonder if like being sexual wasn't at the top of his priority list.
I don't think it was top of his priority.
Yeah, that's what I wonder. It's a fascinating series, and I know we just kind of broached a few of the topics, but one thing they mentioned, but they didn't really go into is, did he really have explosive flatulence?
Oh, yes.
He ate a lot of beans. That was his main diet.
But is it because he was a
stew.
vegetarian?
And sugar.
Or did he have like Crohn's disease or something?
He used to wake up in the middle of the night to eat this special cake that was just 100% sugar.
Well, no wonder these women were committing suicide.
Well, one of the first biographies of Hitler was by a guy called John Tolland. And it was, how can I put it? It was a huge amount of information, but the analysis wasn't, quite at the Kershaw level. But he was the one who said Hitler was the most flatulent leader in modern history, which is a very nice line. And there was a description in his early days when he was an up-and-coming leader, and he would be taken to these meetings in the houses of rich people like the Bechstein family, and he would give this amazing talk. And then as soon as he went out, they'd all rush to the windows, let in some
He was
fresh
just
air.
farting the whole time. Well, Dr. Kaplan, thanks for being on the show and chatting with us. And I definitely want people to go check out Hitler's Secret Sex Life. But I also think they should check out some of the other books that you have authored. And I'm going to post a link to your website. Now, you mentioned that there are a lot of authors that share your name. So you go by Robert M. Kaplan.
Correct.
And you can purchase your books at rkaplan.com.au. So I'll post a link to our site. I noticed that one of the books that you have that you've already published was a book on doctors who kill, called Medical Murder, and that's definitely going to be the topic of a future show here of our podcast. So we might have to invite you back again for that.
That would be very nice. And as I said, I've been working on this thing of 20th century assassins. I'm not talking about the political ones, but I'm talking about the slightly crazy ones like Jack Ruby.
Yeah.
And I think it's a fascinating topic. So just tell me, will you let me know when the podcast is out so I can send the link to inflict on those who still talk to me?
I definitely will. Thanks again for being on the show. And
Thank you.
and take care.
No, pleasure. All the best, folks. We'll be in touch.